So I have 3,000 servers in my data center. Each one is duly connected with 1 gigabit Ethernet. I want a fully redundant design because this data center is really important to my business. And I have 10 gig E uplinks from the access to the core. So what kind of savings would I find with this IBM jtype solution versus a legacy type solution?
Sure, Charles. In this configuration, and obviously we had worked out the numbers for this configuration beforehand, we compared the IBM solution with a legacy vendor solution. And what you can see is huge savings, both from a CapEx and a OpEx perspective. More than 66% savings in pure CapEx or capital expenditure. In addition to that, additional savings in terms of power and space consumption is what the IBM data center solution delivers compared to the legacy vendor. And at the bottom, I've shown you the idea of how the network is being configured. So we're using a top-of-rack design on the IBM solution. We have used 150 of the J48E type platforms. And in the collapsed core aggregation space, we've used 2 JO8E platforms for the IBM solution.
Yeah, so there's a lot of cost savings here, 66% savings. That's really significant. I guess a lot of that is from how we're using far less devices in the aggregation in the core.
Right.
But we're also using a lot less rack space and saving a lot of power. So huge amounts of savings with this kind of design.
That's right, Charles. It's not just the CapEx, power, and space. What's really interesting to note is when you look at the number of operating systems that our customers need to troubleshoot and manage and configure in their networks. With the IBM solution, there's a single operating system running across all different platforms, and that is the Junos operating system. No other vendor can deliver that, and there's just multiple operating systems that our customers need to manage, have all those licenses and training for each of those operating systems that they need to run and maintain in the network, thus really increasing the operating expenses tremendously.
I'd like to point out, if anybody wants to have a personalized total cost of ownership model built for their network, if you contact an IBM partner or an IBM field expert, they'd be happy to run a tool to customize this kind of chart for them. So far we covered a lot of stuff, Didi. We talked about the data center landscape, how we got to where we are today. We talked about the trends that are making it even more challenging to scale data center networks to meet the needs of the growing traffic demands. We've talked about how the IBM jtype products can be used to design a new data center network that's simpler than the old architectures. It leads to incredible total cost of ownership advantages. Now I'd like for us to take a closer look at the IBM jtype products, specifically the IBM jtype E-Series Ethernet switches and the IBM jtype M-Series Ethernet routers.
So let's start with the E-Series switches, and this is the family shot. It's the J48E, the J08E, and the J16E platforms. All of these run the same Junos operating software. Their career class reliability, by virtue of being Junos software, which runs on the biggest service providers all over the world. All of these platforms have massive scalability when it comes to security, quality of service, routing, switching, just amazing table sizes to achieve that massive scale. And as we showed with that virtual chassis feature, and we'll get into that a little more detail, very simple to manage. So let's look at the J48E platform in a little more detail.
What I really want to hear about is the virtual chassis technology, because that sounded like an amazing feature.
We'll get into that. So if you look at the box just in a standalone mode without the virtual chassis configuration, 48 line rate, 10100, 1000 ports. These come with 2 flavors of the uplink modules. You can have 10 gig or 4 gig uplink modules, fully redundant power supply and cooling, which is really critical in a data center network. And again, this runs the Junos operating system.
And I see it says here that it comes with full OSPF layer 3. Is there any kind of license charge or any extra fees for that?
No, unlike a lot of vendors out there, we do not charge for these advanced layer 3 licenses. It comes as a part of the base software. Now let's look at the virtual chassis feature, which is a real differentiator in the industry, and this is the only box in the industry that does that. So up to 10 of these boxes can be cabled up either from the back of the box or even from the uplink ports that are in the front of the box. And essentially you can have 10 of these connected and still look like one single box. Up to 10 of these devices can be managed as a single device.
Okay, that's great. That's our little iron. Let's talk about some of the big boys. How about the IBM J08E and the J16E?
The J08E and the J16E, as we discussed before, are positioned for data center aggregation/core space, and it comes in two flavors. The smaller one is the J08E, which is the 8-slot chassis, and then the 16E is the 16-slot chassis. Both of these have full redundancy in terms of power supplies, routing engines, switching fabrics, etc. They can support up to 128 wired speed non-blocking 10 gigabit ports, and these are ready for the 100 gig interfaces with minimal changes in hardware.
This is some pretty heavy stuff. Let's talk about the routers.
So the routers are the M series, and again, the family is composed of the J02M, the J06M, and the J11M platforms. Again, all of these run on that same Juno software operating system. Very high performance and very efficient platforms. These were designed for high availability ground up, so every single part of each of these boxes is designed for very high levels of availability and resiliency. And they're very flexible in terms of the deployment. They can be used in the collapsed core aggregation space. They have integrated WAN interfaces and can support those mission critical applications like voice, video, data, etc., which are easily supported on any of these platforms. Taking a closer look, I won't go over all the details for these platforms. Apart from routing, these boxes exhibit very good switching and security features. The one thing that sets this family of products apart from the rest of the industry is the very capable virtualization features that these boxes have, in particular MPLS and VPLS features.
Right, and that's a tremendous differentiator with these products is the MPLS and VPLS capabilities, and we're seeing more and more of those being deployed because of those data center interconnectivity things that we discussed earlier. The other important aspect is how virtualization of the network is being combined with virtualization with deeper in the data center, and particularly with on the servers with Power VM. So let's talk a little bit about virtualization between the servers, Power VM, live migration, and our jtype devices.
Sure, and this is also an excellent proof point for integration between the technologies in the server space and how IBM has now taken virtualization to a completely new level by introducing the virtualization features on the networking platforms. So if you look at Power VM, it essentially abstracts the operating system. It does not care about the underlying hardware of the server and the associated operating system it runs. Power VM can run on any platform pretty much. And the second thing is it dynamically adjusts to the server capability. So if you have certain areas of the data center from a server perspective that are running hot, it can migrate to other parts of the data center. So it dynamically adjusts the server capability. If you look at the J48E or the JM series platforms, essentially it abstracts the physical location of these servers and dynamically adjusts to the changing demands of the network. So what you get in the end is a true virtualized solution that is operating system agnostic, it is workload agnostic, and the most critical thing is it is location agnostic.
Right, and that's what virtualization is all about, becoming agnostic about where the application lives and even where the users live, and that's why we want to virtualize the network. So let's discuss being location agnostic a little bit more.
Sure. Let us look at three different scenarios. And these three different scenarios has to do with where the servers are physically located. So in scenario one, these two servers are located within the same data center. They're both running Power VM. And then from a network perspective, we use the virtual chassis capability on the IBM J48E switches, which essentially makes this look like one big flat layer 2 network, and it can be managed as a single device. So very easy migration of Power VM instances in this configuration. Let's look at a slightly more complicated scenario. Now these two servers are at two different locations, maybe at two different data centers. Again, we use the same Power VM technology at the servers at the two data centers, and we use the virtual chassis technology on the IBM J48E switches Like we mentioned before, the virtual chassis technology can be extended over great distances, up to 40, 50, 60 kilometers. So even though these data centers are far apart, that network fabric is going to look like one single switch. It can be managed, operated, and troubleshooting can be done as if it were just one box, although they are great distance apart.
And of course, the big buzzword now is cloud facilities. So how does this help us between different clouds?
Oh, absolutely. Even for cloud situations where now these servers could be literally hundreds and thousands of miles apart from each other, it's still going to work. We still have the same virtualization capabilities. Again, on the server side, if we have Power VM server virtualization software running on both ends, we would leverage capabilities like the virtual chassis, and we would also throw in the IBM M-series platforms with the VPLS technology to enable this flat layer 2 domain across two different clouds to achieve the same level of virtualization, and for the end user make it appear like these were two servers that were just adjacent to each other. So essentially a solution for every scenario, whether the two servers are next to each other, are in the same data center, are in two different data center, or even across two completely different clouds. It's the same virtualization features that work across the board.
Okay. So let me summarize what we learned today. Before, when we used the architectures from the legacy providers, the result was way too many layers, which resulted in way too many devices, too many operating systems, because each of those tiers had specialized devices with their own operating systems, which led directly into multiple management applications. And because we had all those different devices, that means the packet had to touch each of those, which just added latency. And latency has become just more and more critical across the network. We have to reduce the latency. And of course, more devices, more circuits, more there is to deploy, more there is to troubleshoot when there's a problem. And all that results in a lot more difficult to manage. And in the end of the day, it's very complex and very expensive. So what we talked about today is how we could reduce those number of layers. So a simpler topology with less tiers, consolidating the data center network. The result, far fewer devices, which of course means less power, less cooling, less space. So we're being green. Not only green, but we could build these mega data centers cost effectively. What else does that mean? We're going to be able to improve performance because less devices, less uplinks means less areas for congestion and lower latency. Simpler to configure, simpler to troubleshoot. Again, it's just a simpler architecture. Another nice side effect is less equipment, less uplinks, less to break. It's just that simple. So you have increased reliability. At the end of the day, you can have a simpler and more cost-effective network.
We've just made our networks much simpler and much more cost-effective with the IBM data center solution.
So let me tell you where you could go to get more information. If you visit simplifymydatacenter.com, you'll find there network architectures, solution brochures, and even implementation guides like how to deploy Power VM or VPLS between data centers. Or visit IBM.com, and there you can find out lots of details about the jtype products. And that concludes our presentation for today. Thank you, Didi. Appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Charles. Glad to be here.
And I thank you very much for watching this presentation. I'm Charles Goldberg, signing off.